My name is Marisa Drew, and I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer for Standard Chartered Bank. Well, sustainability is core to our DNA in many respects. Our tagline, if you will, is here for good, and I think that expresses so very well how we incorporate sustainability into our thinking. When we say here for good, we mean here for good as in longevity, so this is a long-term game, it's not transactional for us, but we also mean here for good as in doing something to give back to society, whilst also recognizing that we're a private enterprise and our ultimate sustainability is if we have a commercial proposition utilizing our skill set, our resources, what we do as a bank to mobilize capital, that it ensures our own longevity if we get this right. Yes, the role of CSO is relatively new in terms of the position itself, not really existing more than maybe 5 or so years ago. And so every organization would express the CSO role in a slightly different way. In our organization, I have a global remit, and I think of my job as being split almost in two ways. One is I spend about half of my time on everything that we do for and on behalf of the corporation, so everything that we do for Standard Chartered. That involves our public commitments, our net zero program, so our delivery to ultimately get to net zero as an organization, our partnerships, all the work we do to disclose our sustainability metrics. All of that is what I would call the organizational piece. The other half of what I do is for and on behalf of clients. So that really involves our sustainable finance practice. So that is the raising of capital and the provision of advice to our clients along their sustainability journeys in whatever that means to them. That progression that you speak of from the CSR world into something that I consider to be core and strategic as part of the business fundamentals of the bank is very much the journey that sustainability is on. I think if you looked back several years ago, you would have found those in the position, even if it wasn't called a CSO, housed in perhaps the marketing department, because the remit of that individual would have been to showcase all the wonderful things that the organization was doing, but usually around some sort of community service activity. Whereas this has now evolved to being core and fundamental to the business, so the profit-making side of the enterprise. If sustainability is incorporated in that way, it is very much then embedded into how the business operates. That's really where we've come to as I would say, sustainability in organizations today. Embedding is a core and critical component, I think, of ultimately successfully achieving what I would call nirvana in sustainability. We are an organization of 82,000 people, and I think of ourselves as a change function. And what a change function means is typically you're agitating and pushing the organization perhaps faster than it's ready to go because you are the one that's trying to transform. And you can't expect, particularly in a space like sustainability, which is in its hypergrowth phase, for the entire organization to be 100% sustainability facile. But what you need to do at the core of the center is ignite your partners, create a leverage point for them to embrace sustainability. And when you begin to see your partners thinking about sustainability not as something that's on the fringe or the side, but as a core part of their BAU, you know you're achieving success. And in a bank like ours, the second line, so the compliance function, the legal functions, all the support functions have got to be able to increase their capacity and their knowledge so that they can keep up with the front line. I mean, those must go hand in hand. And so today, in terms of how we're thinking about embedding, we are creating opportunities to both educate, but also to create the core competency and skill set and make the investments across the organization in the second line so that they can be there to perform what would be a traditional function, but with that sustainability overlay. It is a very fast-moving space, regulatory intervention. And I think about an organization like ours. We are truly global. We're in more than 50 footprint markets. And what we're starting to see is as the concept takes hold of sustainability across our markets, we see often an expression of political will manifesting itself into regulation. So every political leader who stands up and say, I want to be the greenest country, they're beginning to infuse that across their regulatory organizations. And then they can come into an organization like ours saying, I want a taxonomy, I want want you to disclose your exposures to green and brown. All of that is taking place. And it's hard to manage, and it's not consistent. So this is a bit the challenge that we have in sustainability, is how do we create some sort of a global methodology that is manageable while taking into account those idiosyncratic bits that might be regional in nature. And it's a constant tension, and I think this is something we all have to acknowledge. But most regulation or most standard setting for large global organizations typically starts that way, right? You'll have something at the core, and then you've got to have some sort of a regional sort of adjustment, if you will, in order for it to be embraced in a way that works for those particular jurisdictions. Sustainable finance is at the core of what banks do, which is the provision of capital. So this is really just, in many respects, I say, it is traditional finance with a sustainability overlay. So pretty much all of our core products that we have, that we would offer as a bank, whether it's loans, bonds, other structured products, all of those can have a sustainability flavor or variant to them. And that is progressively the way we're moving, because our investor clients would like to see a tie between the revenues that are generated and outcomes. And that's a little bit what sustainability speaks to. If you then maybe say from the lens of the investor, what does sustainability mean to them? I think it is very much about taking that capital and being able to link it to something that positively impacts society, whether it's environmentally or socially. I'm so glad you asked about social sustainability, because sometimes these days, with the very noisy discussion about climate, the social side tends to get drowned out. And whilst the environment is critical, if we actually take it at its core, environment is all about people, right? It's affecting people as humans, and that sometimes is getting a little bit lost in the climate debate. So at Standard Chartered, we actually create a position called Head of Social Sustainability, and that was a deliberate attempt to have someone have their day job to be associated with the commercial proposition around sustainability. So sometimes when we think of social, we think of the philanthropic side of an organization, a foundation, or what have you. But I was very keen, because when I think about a lot of the ways that the capital that we deploy can make important outcomes, is we focus with people first, and that's the job of social sustainability. So there are products and services around social. For instance, social bonds is a really good example. 5-6 years ago, the concept of a social bond didn't exist, and now it's a $200 billion market. And those are issuances that are geared toward, with their use of proceeds, to things like education, healthcare, gender equality, getting money to female entrepreneurs, if we're thinking about with a gender lens. So there's so many places to go that you can express social in a way that delivers really interesting outcomes on a commercial basis. Balancing the E and the S, as we say, is sometimes a constant challenge. Sometimes they are in competition with each other. So sometimes investments that we might make, or loans that we might make, which are very deliberately intended to increase perhaps economic prosperity, have a bit of a challenge sometimes with the environment, because development is one of those cases where sometimes those tensions comes into play. On the other hand, if we do continuously remind ourselves that the E and the S are integrally intertwined, that climate affects people, then at times it tends to lead you in a path where you can create that right balance. Well, Greece, if any market can probably express the effects of climate change and why it's so urgent, you just take a look at the last several months. Greece went from the most extreme heat, and that resulted in a proliferation of wildfires, to a month later to enormous floods. And the impacts of those extreme weather events from one to the other was hugely impactful in a negative way on some of the core components of the GDP of the country, agriculture in particular, and livestock were deeply affected. There are conventional views that probably knocked something like $5 billion of GDP off of the country's finances in just those sort of 4 months. So I think Greece's absorption of what this means to them is probably a sense of urgency and a call to action. And how do we, and I think this forum that's being convened here, how do we convene global corporates, global leaders, to make sure that we keep this as high on the priority list as everything else that might come in front of us.